thank you so much, Marco, for inviting me to Chapman. I've had an absolutely wonderful time. There is more food. I also got swag. I have my Chapman polo here, t-shirt. So it's been wonderful being in Southern California.
English.
I'm so happy to see people from Riverside or Greg. So a context for this is that I've written several papers about Wittgenstein and Turing, and I was asked to write a Cambridge element, one of these 30,000 word things. I've written one already on Wittgenstein's philosophy of math for the math series, but there's also a whole Wittgenstein series in Cambridge elements, and so David Stern asked me to write one on the later philosophy of mathematics. He was very strict about this. He said, no, it has to be the later plus. And I'm not quite sure how I'm going to do that. But I think because Turing and Wittgenstein talked in 1937 and 1939, that counts as later Wittgenstein. So I'm grappling a bit with this radically anthropological view of logic and mathematics that we see in Wittgenstein's work. So that's where I am right now, and I'll be summarizing a paper that I have written pretty recently that puts some of this together. Okay, whoops. This is now not moving. Here we go. Okay, so today I want to use Hilbert, Wittgenstein and Turing to sort of run through a theme in the concept of surveyability, as I will translate it into English. It's a metaphor. Also, it comes from the German, so Überblickbarkeit, Übersehbarkeit, and Übersichtlichkeit of proof are the three terms, and you can see the verb to see. There's kind of a possibly visual, but I would say it's more like seeing what someone means. It's not really perceptual. There's a lot of controversy in Wittgenstein studies about how to translate this. Elizabeth Anscombe, who struggled with translating Remarks on the Foundations of Mathematics, incidentally, her papers at Penn, if you were ever in Philadelphia and have a couple of hours, it's a beautiful archive at Penn, and you can go and see her draft translations. It's really quite remarkable what she struggles with. She had a different word at one point for surveyability. At times she uses the notion of a bird's eye view, but this is sort of visual. So I'm going to resist the visual nature of this, but we could discuss that in relation to aspects of perception later. Wittgenstein's Blue Book, 1933 to 34, to me is very important background for explaining how Turing managed to come up with the notion of a Turing machine sometime in 1936, 35, 36. Wittgenstein uses the idea of a survey of the concept of a human operating mechanically with self. So that's right in the beginning of the Blue Book, which Wittgenstein dictated to his mathematics students after he decided to cancel the lectures Philosophy for Mathematicians, which he had begun that fall. The students were all excited. There were about 45 of them. They started raising their hands, objecting to Professor Wittgenstein. You know, what are you going to make of the infinite? What do you make of quantum? And Wittgenstein couldn't handle it. Yes.
Robert may say that he cannot see the slide.
Oh,
I can see the slides.
So it's on his end.
Yeah, I can also, I'm on Zoom, I can see the slides, so.
so maybe someone has.
The slides disappeared on my screen.
I'm very, hi, Robert. It's very nice you're here. Hi. Oh,
Good to see you, Juliet.
I'm sorry, I can't see you.
I see
so,
them.
feeling our
Here I am. Here I am.
Yes.
You are now the slides?
No.
Everybody else. I'm afraid everybody else can see them. This has never happened before.
So what we can do, we can.
I think it's on his. I think it's on
If
his
someone
side.
has an email, they could send them to him.
No, you can send them. I send you the slides.
Okay, Marco, I'm going to log out and log back in. Maybe that'll get you the slides. But send them to me.
I send you the slides, so because here we see the slides and we connect to see the slides.
Okay. All right. So one of the things in the background is how did Turing come up with the notion of a Turing machine so quickly? Because he only took a formal mathematical logic course in 1935 from Newman. And we know that Newman used the textbook of Hilbert Bernays, so he was caught up to date. But that's incredibly quickly to come up with the notion of a Turing machine, which is very uncharacteristic of the mathematical logic of the time. So one of my just so stories, or history, my reconstruction of the history, is that one thing that explains it is Turing must have read the Blue Book. And he must have confronted the anthropological attitude Wittgenstein had toward grammar and logic at that time. So the 36 paper, Turing's most important paper, I think, on computable numbers, I would say it's his most important, where he analyzes the notion of computable function and proves that there is no decision procedure in first order logic theory for determining when one sentence follows from another. So there's no general algorithm for figuring out logical validity. That's a very big deal. But already when you talk about valid inference or logic in that sense, you have gone beyond what there is a general algorithm. So that's a very important undecidability result. And Turing in 1936 takes absolutely fundamental two things. One, the comparison between a human being reckoning with pencil and paper according to a fixed rule. It is a human-oriented analysis of computability. And he says explicitly, this is a comparison. So this is the method of language games. It's a comparison. And then he says, as part of his analysis of what goes on when a computer works, one of the marks is that symbols can be taken in by a glance. So if you're calculating according to a fixed rule, if you're calculating according to a fixed rule, there has to be some symbolic configuration that has sufficient economy for you to take it in without further inference to determine what's before your eyes. Okay, so Turing emphasizes this. Now, in 37 to 44, Wittgenstein and Turing had a discussion in the summer of 1937 in Cambridge with Alistair Watson, who introduced them, who was Wittgenstein's students. And Watson published a paper in Mind in 1937 that thanks Turing and Wittgenstein for his understanding of the undecidability results. So we do have some independent confirmation that they did talk in the summer of 37. And very importantly, the major turn toward Wittgenstein's mature later philosophy takes place in the late fall of 1936 and early 1937, at least I would say. This is the point at which a couple of things happen. First of all, he turns toward investigating the notion of what it is to follow a rule, which you would expect if he was grappling with this. He also brings in the notion of a form of life. You can see in the manuscript, he has the notion of kultur or culture. And in the blue and the brown book, to imagine a language is to imagine a culture. But then you can see he gets up into Norway in 36. He takes his pencil and he crosses out culture and he puts form of life. So form of life is much better because it's a much more dynamic, pluralistic, partial, negotiated notion. He also begins to use the notion of technique, in German Technik, which can also mean technology. We can check with German speakers about exactly this. But in the lectures in 1939 that Turing attends at Cambridge that Wittgenstein gives, Turing was already working in Bletchley. He had just started, but he came back, sat in on these lectures. In the 39 lectures, the notion of technique appears 114 times. So what's happening is they've talked before, and Wittgenstein is working through the notion of technique and trying to bring that into his philosophical repertoire at that point. This is very interesting relative to Spengler, because Wittgenstein's generation, of course, read Spengler, Decline of the West. Okay, so Spengler's basic picture is that modernity involves decline, and the mathematics of the time exhibits the cultural center of that time. And basically, we've enslaved ourselves to a capitalistic machine. So these metaphors of machine and technique are very important. And I think Wittgenstein is thinking about logic and math from a cultural point of view at this time as well. But that's not central to what I want to focus on today. Now, in 1939 to 44, Turing goes off to Bletchley and continues to work not only on cryptography, but he also works on logic. So they found fairly recently something called notes on notations. He's there exploring Leibniz, Boole, Schroeder. He's very interested in alternative ways of writing down logic. And he emphasizes very much, as I'll explain, in one paper that was never published, he explicitly thanks Wittgenstein for the ideas. He says, I got these from Wittgenstein's lectures. And the idea is to emphasize phraseology and everyday mathematical speech as foundational to our understanding of surveyability. Okay, so that's sort of a background. Now, an interesting question, regardless of all of this history, is whether surveyability is a requirement of some kind for something to be characterized as a proof. So many proofs and sentences are very difficult to hold in mind and survey at a glance. So it doesn't seem like surveyability can mean easy to take in, because there are some proofs that just are kind of monstrous and well known to be so. But still, even if they're monstrous proofs and have difficult parts and so on, somehow a group of mathematicians is able to hold it in mind. So I don't think we mean a purely visual, and I don't think we mean a purely psychological criterion. This has to be a logical criterion, or maybe a mathematical criterion. Now, are computer proofs or models ways of increasing surveyability? I'm sure you people have a lot of different examples we could talk about. I would give an answer yes and no, but regardless of whether we're dealing with large computer proofs or unsurveyable 100-line proofs in Principia, getting the phraseology right and conceptualizing what's going on is going to be fundamental. I have a hand from Marco.
No.
Oh, you're just scratching. Okay. Ultimately, I think Hilbert, Wittgenstein, and Turing have in mind something every day. What can be done, which is you can gain human communication and agreement that stops. That's what I think surveyability involves. So here's
What's
some,
the fun if we stop disagreement?
but that's philosophy. But in mathematics, or in any other kind of discussion, as we see with, of course, social media, you see, if it's all just a kind of mush, where it could go on and on and on, and there's no such thing as termination, it seems like we're not really dealing with proof. It may even be a question whether we're dealing with information. There's a question to what extent that concept even applies to what's going on. Okay, so, and this is not something, we're working on this, people working on disinformation as a kind of engineering problem or social sciences problem. We were talking about this a bunch. There are a lot of philosophical questions also about disinformation. So one of the themes here about Hilbert, Wittgenstein, and Turing is that psychology does not govern the foundations of logic and mathematics for them. Now, this is a new reading of Turing relative to most of the literature on Turing, which always emphasized mechanist philosophy of mind in connection with him. But I think this is a misreading of Turing. I think it's much closer to Wittgenstein there. So to requote Georg Kreisel, no matter, never mind. Never mind. The limited results of Gödel, Post, Church, and Turing, Post, of course, in 1936, also gives an analysis of computation that is more or less the same as Turing's. And it's pretty much independent, but it has this human-oriented character to it. With Post, you have a letter sorter using mailboxes. It's the sort of heuristic device to get around jungle formalism.
Sorry, Juliet.
Yeah.
These are your claim, or is the claim that you attribute to Wittgenstein? It's not clear.
These are my claims.
Your two claims.
And I am using Wittgenstein in part and Hilbert in order to de-psychologize our reading of Turing. So to the extent that I can crawl along here with these people together, I am attacking the view that Turing was some kind of mechanist about the mind, or functionalist. In general, the limited results of Gödel, Post, Church, and Turing do not turn on any particular theory of mind, I think. And this is against the way Post and Gödel took those results. They thought that they yielded limitations on the human mind. They're very clear about this. And I think that Turing is more on the side with Hilbert and Wittgenstein against this. And I think we can see this by revisiting Turing's analysis in 1936 of the very notion of a formal system of logic and reading him as coming out of questions at Cambridge about the nature of logic that had an anti-psychologist past. Okay, so this is my strategy to try to keep these three kind of lined up. So I have kind of two directions going on. One is to discuss, to insist on Turing's influence on Wittgenstein. I sort of gestured at that. But then we have Wittgenstein's influence on Turing. I think it's a little easier to go to Wittgenstein's influence on Turing, but it's not easy. And then the other direction is very hard because Wittgenstein scholars have their own ideas about what he did. So you get into arguments no matter what you say. Anyway, I'm trying to do both. So first thing to say is Turing's philosophical attitude. These are claims, Marco. Has been distorted by controversies in philosophy of mind, including those by my beloved teacher, Hilary Putnam, who invented functionalism and computationalism about the mind when he was at MIT in the early 60s, modeling inductive logics in sort of empirical contexts. Later, of course, Putnam gave up on functionalism. He had arguments against it. So I'm a later student of Putnam's, and I like that. But anyway, I think Turing, you can't really associate him with behaviorism, with functionalism, with the idea of the singularity in which somehow machines are going to take over and become the primary drivers of cultural change and creativity. So I will show you some quotes to argue for that. Because I think for Turing, the foundations of logic and mathematics, the nature of logic was a really serious question. And that is partly a philosophical question. And that was the main question of Wittgenstein's life. What is the nature of the logical? So here I think they touch each other. Finally, the social matter of intersubjective communicability was crucial in Turing's conception of mathematics. And I think the same is true of Hilbert and Wittgenstein. So another slight point I have to make is Hilbert was not some reductive formalist. This is just untenable as a reading of Hilbert. You're nodding, so that's good. But you do go to certain contexts where people. I have read Wilfred Sieg's work, and I'm completely persuaded. I mean, there's a lot of kind of misinterpretation of Hilbert to get around. So Turing focused on taking what we say and do with words seriously. He's an ordinary language philosopher of logic, and he takes the limits of formal methods into account in many of his writings, not only their power. So everyday language, including our typings of objects as they occur naturally in science and everyday life, are an evolving framework for technology. And Turing stressed human conversation, phraseology, and common sense as foundational. Phraseology being a word not only found in Wittgenstein, but found earlier in Russell in Introduction to Mathematical Philosophy, which was the book that got Turing interested in logic as well as Kleene and Gödel. So we have some commonality here too, historically. So in this sense, I'm reading Turing as a Cambridge philosopher of his time. And although there's excellent work on Turing, and Hodge's biography still remains one of the great biographies of the 20th century, I think he didn't emphasize enough philosophy and logic. He didn't deny it, but he's more interested in neurophysiology, mechanism, behaviorism.
So there is no tension between, you can come back to the other slide, the other one. You say, Turing was neither a behaviorist nor reductive mental mechanist, the foundation of logic and mathematics, not philosopher of mind that was central to his work. Claim, very clear. And then you go on to the other slide, the next one, and you say Turing stressed a conversation, phraseology, and common sense as foundational. In this sense, he was a Cambridge philosopher at his time. So there is no tension between these two claims?
No, although you have to read a couple of papers of mine to justify it. So thank you for pointing that out. So common sense is something Wittgenstein and Turing debate at length in 1939 lectures. We know that Russell, talks about common sense as the metaphysics of the caveman. And then there's, of course, G.E. Moore and Austin. Austin probably thought of Moore as the person who's most important for him. So Turing often talks about common sense. In the very last lines he ever wrote, a little paper on solving problems. Actually, we were discussing solving problems today. He says the limitative results go some way toward showing the need for common sense in the foundations of mathematics. So I'm claiming that Turing is part of this Cambridge tradition first in thinking about the nature of logic very carefully, and specifically thinking about it anthropologically, the foundations of logic in light of Wittgenstein. But I'm also seeing the common sense idea as part of the Cambridge context in which he's working. Now, I have papers where I can show you Littlewood's textbooks on set theory. He didn't call it set theory, he calls it foundations, and also Hardy. So there was a lot of discussion about what's the place of logicism here? You know, are these pointers and tips we give to people to help them see proofs mere gas? Okay, that's something that they talk about. So there's a kind of need at Cambridge to recover ordinary communication about how to look at a proof and how to work our way through, okay, that is produced by the responses to Russell in Hardy and Littlewood. And I trace that out in my paper, but I think that Turing is certainly aware. I mean, these are his teachers. And in fact, the first symbols we have from Principia are in his copy of Littlewood. So Littlewood says, I'm not going to teach you logic, but you need to study logic in Principia in order to understand the underpinnings of these results. And you can see Turing begins to write logic into the copy of the book. So there's kind of a complicated series.
Can I make a?
Yes.
If it's out of date, we can leave to the end.
Yeah.
Was that view of a Turing somewhere relevant for his solving the enigma problem? I mean, his stance on language. Right. I mean, maybe this is another question for another time, but as you were explaining your point of view, I'm thinking about his attitude on solving the enigma problem. You know?
Okay.
And
this is
by
very
paying
interesting.
much attention to phraseology and to language.
He did not, you think?
Yeah, it did.
Yes, of course.
Yeah,
Yes,
it did.
of course.
Much,
Yes, of
much,
course.
much.
Right. Okay. Yes. This
But-
would have reinforced
Yeah.
the view I think he already held in 1936. But I think that view came first. Okay.
Hmm.
Now, obviously, he's there, thank God, solving the enigma, because otherwise Britain would have been starved in 1940. Would have been too good.
Be speaking German.
So, okay, so he's working away with these wrens, with these women who are feeding in the cards and trying to guess what's going on. And they're using common sense to figure out if there's a repetitive series of numbers at the beginning
Exactly.
of one U-boat captain's, thing, then that could mean something about how the weather is that day.
Exactly.
And
That's
then you're
why-
going to recover
Yeah.
through argumentation everything like, right.
Mhm.
So I agree with this. The cryptography is not, it has to take account
Mhm.
of everyday uses of language
Yeah.
in order to solve problems. Okay, that's very interesting. I'm thinking about ChatGPT lately, so Walter, I have to kind of think about,
Yeah.
we'll talk at the end about whether
Yeah, okay.
ChatGPT,
Yeah, yeah.
what the relevance is here to common sense and phraseology.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's in a way the topic
Yeah.
of what he's
Good,
doing.
good.
So when we read the 39 lectures of Wittgenstein, and Turing is in the room discussing with him, you have to remember two things. First of all, they're just lectures with notes taken by students who are, imperfect human beings like the rest of us. But also, Wittgenstein wants to talk with Turing about deeper issues, but he can't really do it because the students don't know that much math. So when you read these lectures, you can see little pieces of things where they're definitely talking about something deeper, and they know it's deeper, but they can't really get dragged down by the students. So I'm just saying, when we read these lectures, we have to be super careful and read the manuscripts that were written at the same time, because Wittgenstein would go home and write with much more sophisticated examples. And surveyability is the major thing in 1939. Major thing he's thinking about in talking to Turing. So it's good, it's helpful. I think that helps my case. But anyway, I'm also trying to get Turing away from the cryptography, because it's a popular meme now, the enigma. Mick Jagger produced the movie and it's really famous now. So I shouldn't overdo that because actually that fits. Thank you. Okay, so he's a Cambridge philosopher of his time. So here's Hilbert, 1920, unproved. Proof procedures become completely surveyable. He's talking about his proof theory, metamathematics. Figures we take in as objects must be completely surveyable, and only discrete determinations are to be considered for them. It's only under these conditions that our claims and considerations have the same reliability and evidence as intuitive number theory. A formalized proof, like a numeral, is a concrete and surveyable object. It can be communicated from beginning to end. So there's the connection with communication and intersubjectivity, right? It terminates in some way. Now, I think for Hilbert, this is very important to his sense of the foundations of mathematics. And it's quite clear that both Turing and Wittgenstein are reworking this and responding to this in the given context. Hilbert will frame the decision problem in terms of his metamathematics. And so Turing, when Turing says the computer can take in a finite number of symbols at a glance, he has to put that in there in the Hilbertian context, because it's part of the context in which the problem has been posed. Wittgenstein is aware of both these things in 1931. And so Wittgenstein is performing what I would call an investigation of the notion of surveyability. Sometimes people think Wittgenstein is laying some kind of requirement down on proof, or has necessary and sufficient conditions for some things counting as a proof. I don't think you can read the manuscripts that way. I think instead he's examining, what is the significance of saying proof has to consist in some way of things that can be taken in without inference and communicated, and communication has to terminate in some way. Those are the marks, not an analysis, but the marks of the concept of proof that belong to its logical role. One thing you could talk about is subatomic. There's a lot in the psychology of number now about this. And Hilbert, of course, yeah.
If we take the last claim here, formalized proof like a numeral is a complete and surveyable object, and it can be communicating from the beginning to the end. So let's formalize the proof. Let's suppose that we have a formalized proof of 2,000 million steps.
Right.
It's surveyable in this sense, but it's certainly not communicable.
Right. So what Wittgenstein
from the beginning to the end.
Right. Well, what Wittgenstein will point out, okay, is that this has significance for our understanding of what foundations of mathematics are all about, because it's the same with Principia. To prove 7 + 5 = 12, Kant's theorem, you have to go around the room 12 times in Principia. It's really long. But Wittgenstein points out, well, that's okay. We can apply arithmetic to the parentheses and other things and have algebraical representations of this giant thing, and we'll use mathematics to make sense of it. So the view is that Principia is not a foundation for mathematics, it's just more mathematics. And he says the same thing about Hilbert's metamathematics. It's more mathematics and not the worse for it. But you have to then ask yourself, what do we mean by a foundation? And here Wittgenstein is very careful. He does not focus on Frege's word Grundlagen, okay, but he uses the German word Grundlegung, which is a sort of laying out of what is basic. But when you're laying out what's basic, that's different from providing some kind of foundation. So I think it's very important. Okay, so Hilbert uses the stroke notation to make his points. Obviously, it's too difficult for a human to take in at a glance without counting, arranging, or labeling. I mean, maybe you can. I got tired of using Beamer to draw strokes. But anyway, if you want a few more strokes there before you can easily determine when it's the same, that's fine. Our number sense, that is to say, the things psychologists like to study now. So I sometimes hear from my philosopher biologist friends who love animals, I mean, I love animals too, that spiders do arithmetic. Spiders have number. And this drives me a little bit crazy as an analytic philosopher. It is true that probably there's something neurophysiologically and evolutionary built in pretty early that enables the spider to differentiate between 2 spots and 3 or something like that. And the subitizing generally gives out after about 4. Okay, so I mean, these are results, but this is not the same as saying that the spider has the concept of number. I mean, this is nonsense. So, but it is true that our number sense, that is to say, our ability to take in at a glance, the subitizing gives out very quickly in the stroke notation, and Hilbert points this out. It gives out later in the decimal notation. That's one use of decimal notation. And of course, there are lots of other notations too. Now, Kripke, in his Whitehead lectures of 1992, sort of twists this in a certain direction. And he develops this notion of a buck stopper. So he develops a new foundation of arithmetic based on the natural numbers. And you take as basic 1, 2, and 3, and these are regarded as the buck stoppers. So he thinks he can have some kind of logicist analysis of number resting on this. But I would think that if we think about Hilbert, Wittgenstein, and Turing, thinking about the nature of logic, the important point is there must be buck stoppers. It's not a question of which things are buck stoppers in particular. It could be the Arabic notation, it could be the decimal, it depends very much on the context. And the important point is that this is a representational necessity of logic and not simply a feature of the human mind or spiders or anything else, and not a feature of particular notation. But there has to be something you can take in at a glance and communicate. That would be the idea.
This.
Yeah.
It's just earlier you were saying this isn't a matter of psychology.
Yeah.
But it's too difficult for a human to take in at a glance.
Right.
Is that connected to, it seems to me that would be a psychological factor.
Okay, I'm glad you're asking. So this is why I'm railing about the spider things and the number sense, because there's a lot of cognitive psychology, which is very fascinating, on the psychology of number. Okay. But what is Hilbert's point? Hilbert's point is not best read as a psychological point. It is best read as a foundation of logic or mathematics point. The point is, we need mathematics to distinguish big collections of stroke from one another. That's one reason we need it. So part of the foundations of mathematics lies in what you might regard as a psychological fact. But for Hilbert, it really turns on where mathematics starts. We need mathematics. You build the Arabic notation, or you build some account of the long proof in Principia. You develop some algebraic analysis of the proof. And that's what mathematics is for. And I'm taking that not to be a psychologistic foundation for mathematics. It's part of our notion of the logical. So it belongs to the notion of the logical and the mathematical, that you can put these things together at the right level to get surveyability. Does that help?
It would be a psychological fact, perhaps, but it is inside this framework, which is what more logical and the.
There's a different problem being spoken to than just at what point do people stop being able to discriminate the stroke.
Well, sure, but psychological facts condition how the mathematics is built.
Well, condition is a big word, so, okay. I mean, if you cut off my head, I won't talk. That's also true. I wouldn't deny. That's from William James, by the way. Of course. But then it's a very different thing to say that the nature of my thought lies in the brain. You have to have some kind of account of what you mean by thought.
It is certainly a condition of our doing arithmetic that we were able to distinguish the symbol for 1 from the symbol for 2.
Right.
But this does not mean
Right,
that the
yeah,
distinction between 1 and 2 is psychological.
Right, that would be a step to say that. Because it would claim that the psychological facts determine and explain the mathematical ones.
Right.
And this is what I'm denying Turing thought. Okay, that's very helpful.
This notion of backstopper seems to me that is even much more fundamental than this, because in the end of the story, it seems to me that pertain to the fact that by essence mathematics needed to be able to solve the problems. But to solve the problems means to be able to distinguish a step in the solution from the solution.
That's a
When
good
you
way to
arrive
put
at the
it.
solution is given. So if I ask what is the square root, what is the root of an equation, I have a lot of passage to arrive to the solution. But when I say that this equation is root 5, that is finished. And
Yep.
not to ask what is the root that is 5. It's 5. Finished.
Very good. So we can see
if I have
something
no
as a
that, I
solution.
would not have mathematics because I would not have way to solve problems. Then you can decide where the solution is. You can say that the solution is when you write right, or the solution is something else, but it's another story. But mathematics require that something is a solution.
That something is a solution, right? Or if you're proving that there is no solution, like in the
That's
sixth
another
paper,
story.
we'll talk about that. That's important too, to be able to prove that there is a solution of a certain kind. Right? So that's very helpful. Okay, now here's Wittgenstein making the same point, and I would regard this as a logical point. I read Wittgenstein's later work, I read the Investigations as a book in logic. Okay. My students are like, what? That's not what we study in our logic course. But it is in the sense of logos, in the sense of thinking through what reasoning is. Okay, there's a lot of argumentation there. But here's something brought up also in the 39 lectures. A dispute may arise over the correct result of a calculation, say of a rather long addition, but such disputes are rare and of short duration. Otherwise, we lose the notion of a solution. They can be decided, as we say, with certainty. Mathematicians don't, in general, quarrel over the result of a calculation. This is an important, you might say, anthropological fact about our forms of life. Were it otherwise, if, for instance, one mathematician was convinced that a figure had altered unperceived, or that his or someone else's memory had been deceptive, and so on, then our concept of mathematical certainty would not exist. In the very first lecture of the 39 lectures, Wittgenstein makes a joke with Turing about this. He says, suppose I teach Turing what the Greek letter sigma is, and I write it on the board, and now I ask Turing to bring me a sigma or to write down a sigma, and he goes and cuts that thing out of the board. Okay, so that's going to show that he doesn't really understand what's going on with the use of symbols in mathematics. Okay. The Entscheidungsproblem of Hilbert could be stated this way. Show that there exists a definite method that can determine for every statement of mathematics expressed formally in an axiomatic system using first-order logic, whether or not that statement can be deduced from the axiom. So find a definite method means find an algorithm, we would say. And what Turing will show is that there isn't one. Now, to prove the impossibility result, that there is no such solution, it's harder than if it was a positive result because, well, it's different. If there were a positive result, if there were a definite method, then all you have to do is write down the algorithm. That could be hard, but that's what you have to do. But to show that there is no algorithm, you have to give an analysis of what it would have been for there to be an algorithm, and it has to be an exhaustive analysis, and then you can rule out all possibilities. Okay. So what you have to do is to analyze what's meant in general by a formal system and a step in a formal system in the relevant Hilbertian sense. And this could not be done, I would argue, by simply writing down another formal system or by discussing in the meta-language various kinds of different formal systems. I think you have to do something different. What you have to do is philosophical. You have to get people to look at the activity of writing down formal proofs and formal steps in a different way. And that's a truly philosophical conceptual move. That's why the 36th paper of Turing is great. So now, what the things came out in the history of the 1930s, which is very detailed, and it's very beautifully written up by a lot of different people. So I'm just going to allude to that here. The reason that lambda definability and the Herbrand-Gödel-Kleene equational systems were being used, and also why Turing devised his machines with command tables, these were called logic-free approaches. Those people appreciated what I just said. You couldn't just write down another formal system in order to go to the heart of what a formal system is. You had to analyze the notion of a formal system. Okay, but the people like good old Herbrand, Kleene, these people were coming out of the Hilbert context. They were mathematicians. And of course, they were going to use equations and the lambda calculus. I mean, it made perfect sense. So the tools they were using, unfortunately, created a kind of jungle. Post noted this. Post said these forbidding alien formalisms. There's like a jungle of this stuff. We got to cut through that jungle. It's getting too messy, okay? That's what Turing does with the notion of a Turing machine. So, in terms of the history, in 1935, Church, Claney, and Rosser showed the class of functions calculable in the HGK equational calculus is coextensive with the class of lambda definable. So it's very interesting. We have these two very different looking characterizations of effectively computable function, and they're coextensive. Okay, so that's pretty interesting. Then Church, building on Gödel's incompleteness paper, demonstrates that there's no effectively calculable function which decides whether two lambda definable expressions are equivalent. And that essentially resolves the decision problem in the negative. So Church does it in 1936. He anticipates Turing's result that there is no decision problem. However, Turing's way of doing it is so much better and so much cleaner that they published his paper, and they wouldn't have published it otherwise. When he gave it to Newman, his teacher, one reason to think that he hadn't worked that closely with Newman, but he had been working with the Wittgenstein crowd, was Newman looked at this and he had no idea what it was. He thought it had no bearing on mathematics. It's not in the blueprint of what was going on. It doesn't have equations. I mean, where's the formalism? So that's an argument, I think, on my side. So Turing 1936 shows that there's no machine, but the machine is really a human, that can compute the desired general procedure as an application of his wholly novel analysis. And then he has to put in his appendix, because Church's paper had already come out, he can show that the functions his Turing machines can compute, he didn't call them Turing machines, Church did, the functions his machines can compute are exactly those that are lambda definable. So now it's a real confluence of analyses of computable function. They look very different, lambda calculable, Turing calculable, HGK system equations. Turns out they capture the same robust class of functions. So that's a wonderful confluence in mathematics. But the point is that Turing's particular way of resolving this is not the application of a pre-existing blueprint of ideas and methods in the metamathematics literature. Rather, he's offering, I think, a philosophically informed analytic exercise. It's an intuitively satisfying surveyable survey of surveyability in a funny way. And his deployment of that central argument bears the stamp of Wittgenstein's way of thinking about logic anthropologically and not metamathematically, even though the result concerns the metamathematical context. Yes?
Historical question. Was Turing aware of Church when he did his thing, or was it completely independent and then he found out that...
He was aware, I think, of Church's work, but not of the 36 result. I think he worked independently. I think he was crushed when he found out. He thought he had anticipated. I think at least my understanding of this is that it was independent. But there was an issue about publishing it because Church had gone into print, So the reason to publish it is that it's just a very different looking, and as we'll see in a moment, much more satisfying analysis, but that's the philosophically saturated idea. Okay, so what does Turing do? Turing makes the notion of a formal system plain every day. He rips it out of this jungly context, and he gets to something surveyable. So he analyzes what a step in a formal system is by thinking about what it's for, i.e. what a human being does with the formal system. And the comprehensiveness of his treatment, its lack of morals, to quote Carnap, in logic there are no morals, the lack of morals lies there. He makes the very idea of a formal system homespun. And Wittgenstein in 1947, thank goodness, did write something explicitly to Turing's argument. Good for me as an historian. Turing's machines are humans who calculate. And exactly this place, Wittgenstein goes through precisely the diagonal argument that Turing uses in the 36 paper, which is not the halting argument. So I can say something about that in a little. It's a very special diagonal argument. It's a positive diagonal argument. Here's Claney looking back on the history of the 1930s in a great paper of 1981. Turing's computability is intrinsically persuasive, but lambda definability is not intrinsically persuasive. And general recursiveness from the Gödel paper, scarcely either. Its author, Gödel, being in 1934, not at all persuaded that it analyzed the idea of effective calculability or calculation in a logic. So Turing kind of put together the notion of effective calculability, calculability in a logic, in terms of the notion of a Turing machine, which is a human being. Okay, so here's Wittgenstein on surveyability, investigating surveyability as part of proof. Then he puts in quotes, obviously quoting from Hilbert, a mathematical proof must be surveyable. We construct the proof once and for all so that it will stand. And the idea is that principia proofs need to be made surveyable, we've already said this, and that communicability is a central feature. Felix Mulholzer has done a whole commentary on the 1939 manuscripts of Wittgenstein. It's in German, it's really quite wonderful. And he goes through the manuscripts very carefully and systematically, and he comes up with these 5 marks of Wittgenstein's use of surveyability in these manuscripts. 1, the surveyability of a proof consists in its possibility of exact reproduction. Secondly, the reproduction must be a relatively easy task. Third, we have to be able to decide with certainty whether the reproduction produces the same proof. So for Felix, it's the re-identification of proof that is very central. And the reproduction of a proof is the sort of a reproduction of a picture or model. There's your aspect perception, some kind of modeling. And also surveyable doesn't imply mathematical understanding. Okay, so the fact that a proof is surveyable doesn't necessarily involve a normative claim about what it is to really understand it. Okay, so for me to really understand the 36 paper, you have to have read the blue book. Okay, but you could argue with that. You could say, no, a Turing machine, after all, is just a mathematical object, right? It's a set of quintuples. The whole thing wouldn't work unless it was. So I'm not claiming that that isn't an understanding.
So,
Yeah.
what is the delta between surveyable and understandable? And if you tell it quickly according to him, we can have a proof that is surveyable, but we do not understand why rather than another why. So what would require more to understand?
Well, here there are a variety of cases, right? I mean, and this is why the notion of technique, I think, becomes very important. So sometimes there could be a proof, it looks like a trick. Okay, so you can talk about Scott's trick, or you talk about Gödelization as some kind of trick, some kind of parlor game. But to go from being a trick, okay, like some weird thing that happens to work in that context, it's very different. Or Cantor's diagonal argument, you regard this as some kind of trick. But to really become part of the proof mechanism that we understand, it should be regarded as a technique. And then you could look at the variety of purposes toward which this mode of argumentation could go. Now, this is obviously a many-colored, many-sorted, multiple different families of ideas about what it is to really understand. So you could have understood Cantor's diagonal argument. Let's see. But maybe you couldn't really understand it unless you understood the original proof Cantor gave, which was not a diagonal argument. It was about processes of real numbers as you calculate. And then you could say, well, you also really don't understand the diagonal technique. This is what interests Wittgenstein. Unless you understand that that technique has nothing intrinsic to do with real numbers and higher infinites. It's a purely finitistic sort of thing. And so on and so forth. Gödelization might have looked like a trick in the 1931 paper. It becomes a technique of proof. So I think the notion of technique helps us see how the understanding is kind of related to this.
Yes, just perhaps this, what you're saying now points to the idea that to understand then the role of a proof inside a bigger system, then you need more context, because even to understand the technique, you need to understand in comparison with other techniques inside a system. Yeah.
Exactly. Every technique, as opposed to a trick, has a certain kind of generality but I don't mean quantificational generality. I mean purposive generality, like a gearbox. It's a piece of technology. So you figure out you could use a hammer to do something, you know, that's kind of interesting. There's a connection.
How does surveyability relates to the possibility of checking the correctness?
I think the connection is quite strong in the Hilbertian context that we're doing. If we are constantly coming to blows over, you know, whether this thing written on the board is a sigma, we're not going to get anywhere toward this. And similarly with any other proof. So I'll talk a little about AI at the end. I'd like to talk about that today, you know, whether these are proofs and so on. It's kind of interesting. There are, of course, statistical packages. There are statistical models, obviously. Turing, by the way, has the O machines, the random non-deterministic Turing machines already in the 46 paper. So he certainly is aware of that. That doesn't fall outside. But in the Hilbertian context, I think we do have to have some possibility of the relatively easy, and this is very fuzzy, relatively easy way of establishing this person has produced. If you don't have that and everybody's unclear about who in the room understands it, then we don't have a proof. It's a mark of the classical concept.
The problem with this definition is that it seems to me that it departs from the anthropological vision, as you say, because suppose that you have a proof of 2 million steps, each of one is locally. But if you are a human being and you have to validate the correction of anyone, fatally you will make an error at a certain moment. Even you. So because it's too long, so lack of distraction or something like that. So I think that it cannot simply be what is in principle possible to validate the correction.
Okay, but
It's what we are in fact able.
But we here is very important.
So take,
because I could get very tired after line 1000.
yeah,
But I can always, and I'll show you in the Turing paper, I can always hand it off to a coworker. So we is very important. And I think that's why it's not really in tension with the anthropological point of view. And by the way, that's in Turing's paper. It makes this very clear. So I'm not sure. We'll come back to this with AI because I think that's a more difficult. Okay. So the main Hilbertian point, I'm afraid I'm going very slowly here. I will need section 2. That's okay. The main Hilbertian points for our purposes of the Turing 36 context is symbolic processes are a precondition of the application of logic in mathematics. I think that is part of what's going on. It doesn't mean that mathematics is about formal objects or something like that. This is the nonsense in reading Hilbert as some kind of ontological formalist. But, you know, if it belongs to logical, you got to be able to write it down in some communicable way. In some sense, our thinking is parameterized through language. These symbols are extra logical, discrete, and intuitively immediate before all thought. This would be Hilbert's view. I think Wittgenstein would logicize the point and regard them not as extra logical. The symbols are irreducible. In other words, you can't have some symbol like a numeral and suddenly it begins wavering and you have to analyze that thing into, you know, a million bits or something. Logics and mathematics certainty depends upon the surveyability of the symbols in all their parts. So this is Hilbert's idea of simplicity. And it involves communicability and termination of disputes, resolution of differences with certainty. And so I just want to reiterate, Hilbert is not a formalist about the content of mathematics. He simply is exploring neither psychology nor some ontology, but marks of the concept. Okay, now I'm going to skip that. Okay, here is the 36th paper. Everyday marks of the concept of calculation. So Turing machines have to have these marks because otherwise they won't speak to the Hilbertian context, which is what Turing is trying to analyze. A human computer works locally, step by step, and can only take in certain numbers of symbols at a glance. That's an allusion to Hilbert. The computer, says Turing, takes in simple operations so elementary it's not easy to imagine them further divided. That's pretty much an explicit reference to Hilbert as well. And now this took the point of we. We quote, avoid introducing the notion of a state of mind. Okay, I think that is a proof text for my non-psychological reading of this paper, but okay. We avoid introducing the notion of a state of mind, and incidentally, you could see exactly the same move in the opening of the Blue Book. Wittgenstein says, imagine we take the mental state and put it out in a picture out there. You'll see it does the same work. So from the Blue Book, we avoid introducing the notion of a state of mind by considering a more physical and definite counterpart. It's always possible for the computer to break off from his work, go away and forget all about it, and later come back and go on with it. If he does this, he must leave a note of instructions written in standard form, explaining how the work is to be continued. This note is the counterpart of the state of mind. So that's like at Bletchley. Any coworker can go on and carry on the work. Okay, so that would be the answer to the community of we. Turing offers a language game on my reading, not a thesis about computability. We've heard a lot of things about the Turing thesis and so on. I would like to pull Turing away from that. Turing says he's going to argue first by intuition, something Wittgenstein never would have said, but he means it in a loose sense. Second, by showing the set of lambda calculable functions is coextensive with the set of Turing computable ones. And third, by giving examples of computable real numbers. So the argument form is not to have a thesis based on some mathematical fact. It is instead to be very vivid. Suppose that what a human computation is in general, something like this, and then you imagine a human being with a piece of paper and you take these in. Then how could the procedures followed not yield surveyability? I think something like that is the form of what's going on. Okay. The Hilbertian features again, he crafts his particular diagonal argument carefully, so that even an intuitionistic logic who rejects the law of excluded middle in a context can accept the proof. This argument I call the do what you do argument. It's kind of funny, and I only realized that this was in the 36 paper by looking at Wittgenstein's rendition of the argument first. Then Felix Mulholzer, I was in Göttingen with him, he said, Juliet, this isn't a proof. You have to convince someone it's a proof. So then I went back and read Turing's paper. This is the proof in Turing's paper, and Wittgenstein knows it. So normally with Cantor's diagonal argument, you set up a purported listing of all the countable sequences. Then you go down the diagonal, and let's say you change 0 to 1 or 1 to 0, and then you construct the diagonal number that's not on the list. Okay. Now, in the case of the computable function, imagine you have a Turing machine that can determine and decide the behavior of any other Turing machine. By the way, we know there is a universal Turing machine because you can string all of the command structures of Turing machines together. So there's one machine that does the work of all. However, what's crucial is you can't diagonalize out of the class of Turing computable functions. Why? Okay, now Turing sketches what we would call the halting argument in the 1936 paper. So imagine that you have some general machine that can decide it all. You could go down the diagonal of the listing of Turing machines and you build the contrary machine. Okay, so the contrary machine would halt whenever that particular machine didn't halt. And you can go down and you're essentially building negation into the machine. And then the idea would be like in Cantor's diagonal argument, that machine is not on the list, so you're done. Now that's normally, or to assume that machine is on the list will generate a contradiction because it halts if and only it doesn't halt on a particular. The traditional argument of the halting argument, which is due to Martin Davis, about 1952, that is an indirect argument. Like with the contour argument, you generate a contradiction. But what Turing says in the 36 paper is, oh, well, there could be something like this. And then he says, but it might leave someone with an uncomfortable feeling. Now, in my own mind, this is Wittgenstein and his philosophical cohort, because you don't want to build into your analysis of a formal system that the person has to agree to use the law of the excluded middle in every context. So you don't want to argue indirectly. So you have to adapt the argument. So what does Turing do? he offers this positive diagonal argument. You define a machine by going down the diagonal, okay? And it's positive. You don't change anything. You just say, you know, machine 1 does such and such on input 1, 1, and 2, 2, and you're just picking off the behavior of this machine from the diagonal. Okay, now the argument is a little bit funny. It's not really a fully extensional argument, but it works like this. Okay, now suppose you have this Turing machine that can determine the behavior of any Turing machine on any input. And so if you could do that, you could construct this positive diagonal machine. But there's a problem there because you're saying that that machine is somewhere on the list. Now, suppose it's the 100th. The key to the argument is you have to suppose it's the 100th. You have to parameterize it. So suppose you say it's the 100th. Then the problem is when you get to asking the machine what to do on input 100, the 100th machine on input 100, what it answers is, I do what the 100th machine does. I do what I do. Now, if you draw a card in a game that tells you to do what you do, you can't do anything. Now, of course, do what you do will work if you're teaching someone to ride a bike and you're already in some living context. You say, keep doing what you're doing. But in the context of the decision problem, do what you do is viciously circular. It reduces that machine to a tautology, which is extremely Wittgensteinian. And I'm sure this is why Wittgenstein liked this. So what it shows is that the notion of being able to follow a rule is fundamental to the notion of logic. That's what it shows. Because do what you do, just like that. You can't follow it. It's not that it's contradictory. So it's not.
You mean it cannot be falsifiable in this sense? Tautological in that sense?
It's tautological. Do what you do. What does the 100th machine do on input 100? It does what the 100th machine does. I mean, that's no help. That's not surveyable. It doesn't terminate in a sense. What it shows is, first of all, very Wittgensteinian, that tautologies, the emergence of tautologies, show you something about the basic notions of logic.
It shows nothing.
Well, the fact that it can be constructed. You see, the diagonal machine is definable, but it's not computable.
Mm-hmm.
So you're showing that the two concepts come
Yes,
apart,
yes, yes.
okay? But that's turning on the idea that following a rule in the real world is part of our concept of being a machine that computes. Also, it's not part of our notion of following an algorithm or a rule that you are or are not an intuitionist or a classical logician. You don't want that. It's not part of our notion of following a step-by-step formal system that you are not an intuitionist. You don't want that. So that's why Turing says this would leave you with an uncomfortable feeling. And Bernays, in the corrections to the paper that he sent, that he got him to write, Bernays says, you better point this out. Point out Brouwer. So Brouwer's mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Now that is only possible with someone who had read a great deal of philosophy and thought, I say in Wittgensteinian terms, about this. And it also shows that the analysis is, again, independent of states of mind. It's not that do what you do is an unthinkable thought or something like that, right? It just is empty. You can't do anything. That's where the limits of the algorithm lie. Anyway, to me, this is both Hilbertian and very Wittgensteinian. I will contrast it with Carnap's principle of tolerance. The choice of logic is not an issue here. The choice of linguistic framework is not an issue. It doesn't matter which symbols you use. The consistency of a command structure is not an issue.
What is a consistency in this concept?
Well, if you want some proof that somehow a Turing machine is consistent, okay, first of all, we know because of the undecidability result. Okay, the problem here is you can't always tell what it's going to do. Okay, you can have really simple equations. This is kind of what Turing shows. Wolfram calls this computational irreducibility. It's the same idea. But, you know, formerly in the history of science, if you had some simple equations, you could think, well, let's put in the inputs and, you know, predict, like with Laplace, what's going to happen. But the point with computable is you have to run the stupid thing before you can see exactly what it's going to do. You can't really envision all the way. So that's that's a feature of the particular question that's being asked. Whereas the internal coherence or strength of a particular formal system is a different kind of a question. And again, I want to say it's not the formalization alone that settles the analysis, even though it's, to repeat, very important that a Turing machine is a mathematical object. It has several faces. I mean, if it weren't a mathematical object, this whole thing wouldn't work. But it's not only a set of quintuples. Okay. So this is Wilfred Sieg, the historian of Hilbert, whose work I like so much. More importantly, in the given intellectual context, the move from arithmetically motivated calculations to general symbolic processes that underlie them has to be carried out programmatically by human beings. The Entscheidungsproblem had to be solved by us in a mechanical way. It was the normative demand of radical intersubjectivity between humans that motivated the step from axiomatic to formal systems. So I like this radical demand that he has here. He's not a person who's sort of radical by nature, but I think that that's very nice. Now, Gödel loved this feature of Turing's analysis. In all other cases treated previously, such as demonstrability or definability, one has been able only to define those notions relative to a given language. And for each individual language, it's clear that the one thus obtained is not the one looked for. For the concept of computability, however, although it's merely a special kind of demonstrability or definability, the situation is different. By a kind of miracle, it's not necessary to distinguish orders, and the diagonal procedure does not lead outside the defined notion. Now, I don't think it's a miracle. I think that it's actually a feature of Turing's analysis. But anyway, Gödel loves the fact that the analysis is independent of a particular formalism. The precise and unquestionably adequate definition of the general concept of formal system. Now, I'm not sure that there are such things as unquestionably adequate definitions, so I just want to say, but I'll read this and then I'll take your question. The completely adequate definition of a general concept of formal system made possible by Turing's work allows the incompleteness theorems to be proved rigorously for every consistent formal system containing a certain amount of finitary number theory translation. After he proves his incompleteness result in 1931, Gödel has a problem. Because suppose you agree that his system P, okay, contains sentences of arithmetic that are neither provable nor refutable, that's only system P. So why can't someone say, well, hey, Gödel, I'm dreaming up some new system here, and you're going to have to deal with that. So the scope of the incompleteness theorem was a problem. And for Gödel, what was great about Turing was Turing settles it, all formal systems. We have an analysis of what this is. With Turing's analysis of commutability, one has for the first time succeeded in giving an absolute definition of an interesting epistemological notion, i.e. one not depending on the formalism chosen. So it's formalism free, and it's absolute in the sense that the class of computable functions doesn't change. If you add strong axioms or alter your language, you can zoom wherever you want, and that has a lot to do with the ubiquitous applicability of computational models in our world. Okay.
Yeah, I have a question on this not depending on the formalism chosen.
Yeah.
Right? Because there are lots of different machines, right? So one way, two way, multiple tapes, deterministic, non-deterministic, whatever. It's they fill a book. So aren't they all different formalisms, these different machines? The machines are the formal system, right? So Turing's analysis depends on the formal system as defined by a choice of machine.
But I'm arguing that Turing's analysis is more general. I'm sort of agreeing.
Oh,
with
I
Gödel
see.
here.
So you see,
The general notion.
like once he fixes a machine, it's dependent on the choice of a formalism, but his analysis
Independent.
his analysis is more general than that.
That's correct.
Okay.
It doesn't
And
matter.
why couldn't the other language-dependent formalisms make the same thing?
Well, because the lambda calculus is specific.
Right, so it's a Turing machine.
Yeah, but a Turing machine has very minimal things associated with it, right? It's only,
Lambda
finite
calculus
number
is
of
also very
symbols.
minimal, right? It's just function application.
Yeah, but you still have the notion of function. in there.
But how is function more primitive or easy to understand than, or more difficult to understand than an infinite tape?
Okay, well, agreed. But that would be the idea that it's just unlimited. Okay, he has to have potentially infinite
Yeah.
as part of this. So they are mathematical objects. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And they have to be. But I still think I agree with Gödel and with Kleene that there is something more generalizable, less prejudicial about the idea of some human being with a pencil and paper writing down some kind of system, symbols, and it doesn't really matter what those symbols are, and internal grammatical features of these sentences don't presuppose a function, or they don't presuppose equations and an analysis of identity. I think they are intended to be, though completely mathematical objects, of course, they are intended to be more language-free, syntax-free.
So I would like
More
to,
that's a very misleading way of putting it. They are intended to be independent of any specific choice of syntax itself. They transcend somehow.
I would like to agree with you, but I think there's still a problem, which is like we can think about, as you say, we can think about Turing this way because afterwards we learned whatever variation you put on the machines, they define the same notion of computability.
Right.
But interestingly, this stops being true when we go beyond sequential computation.
Correct.
It's not true for
Correct.
concurrency.
Correct.
And so now maybe it's just a miracle in the end.
Okay, maybe it is a miracle. He does have the O machines. He does have non-deterministic Turing machines that he brings up in the paper. So he's certainly aware this could go on. And of course, his thesis of 1939, which he's writing when he comes to Wittgenstein's lectures, that has to do with trying to get beyond Gödelian incompleteness by having an oracle. Please notice that that is an anthropological. It's very good, an oracle. And by the way, Post hates it. Post has a footnote where he says, this idea of an oracle, this is, the if is a much better piece of logic.
Now you mentioned Post, right? So he
Yeah.
tried to do a similar thing as Turing in some way, right?
Yeah,
You
in some
also,
sense.
so how would you put him into the whole story?
Well, the way I've brought him up so far is to say that for Post, these are limitations to the human mind. He definitely says that. Whereas I'm going to keep arguing that Turing, I'm sorry, slides here. I'm going to argue that I must have gotten excited.
Not surveyable.
I'm sure I was doing
The
it.
slide is not surveyable.
Oh, there we
Okay,
go.
now it's surveyable.
Where was it? Post is a very interesting case, but Post seems to have treated this psychologistically. He thinks that it's a limit to the human mind, and Gödel's the same way. Gödel, in fact, reads Turing as a mechanist about the mind. So he says this assumption that a finite states of mind have to be collected in the way a Turing machine says. He thinks about Leibniz. What if the human mind can make an infinite series of steps all in one? Of course, Turing doesn't deal with that. But what I would say there is it's not part of the Hilbertian context. And what Turing has to do is to craft something that will fit exactly here. And so it's fair. It's fair that he doesn't. But you're quite right. He's aware of other things. This is why I don't want to say he has an analysis of computability as such, or a thesis, which makes it sound like it's not an argument at all. But I think if you look at the historical context, what Gödel is saying has force. So, I want to be very careful there, but it's a good point about other Turing machines. Okay. That's the lecture one. I'm going to skip over that. Okay, now I have to get to the later Turing on phraseology and a paper he wrote in 1942 to 44 called The Reform of Mathematical Notation when he was at Bletchley. And he says explicitly there, the statement of the type principle given below was suggested by lectures of Wittgenstein, but its shortcomings should not be laid at his door. So that is a proof text that he got something out of those 1939 lectures. And I'll just read you for fun, not the statement of the type principle, but basically the same use everyday mathematical language. Symbolic logic is a very alarming mouthful for most mathematicians, and the logicians are not very much interested in making it more palatable. It seems, however, that symbolic logic has a number of small lessons for the mathematician. I mean, this is not a logicist speaking, which may be taught without it being necessary for him to learn very much symbolic logic. In particular, it seems symbolic logic will help the mathematicians improve their notation and phraseology. We should conduct an extensive examination of current mathematical, physical, and engineering books and papers with a view toward listing all commonly used forms of notation and examine them to see what they really mean. This will usually involve statements of various implicit understandings as between writer and reader, again, a Wittgensteinian point, and speaking to the notion of understanding. But the laying down of a code of minimum requirements for possible notation should be exceedingly mild, avoiding the straitjacket of a logical notation. So again, reminds me of the Blue Book. It would not be advisable to let the reform of notation take the form of a cast iron logical system into which all the mathematics of the future are to be expressed. No democratic mathematical community would stand for such an idea, nor would it be desirable. Now, I am told that he was reading Quine's Mathematical Logic at the time. He really didn't like this Carnapian determination of ontology by the language. So much more.
And if the mathematical community is not democratic,
he was worried.
why should it be democratic? The mathematical
He's
community?
really worried about democratic communities. I'll get to that. He's really worried with AI about English dominating. You know, he's very far seeing. Okay. Now we have to talk about Turing and AI. Okay. So in 1948, he wrote a report to the National Physical Laboratory. This is the founding document of AI. And he comes up with the idea that, and I think this is, again, a very Wittgensteinian. I think if you could learn one thing from Wittgenstein, intelligence consists in appreciating the variety of different searches, different kinds of search. Think about his first paper. It all kind of fits together. That's one thing you could learn from reading philosophical investigation, I would say. So here he talks about searches. So there are three kinds of search. He starts predicting what will be in the future, and it's very far-seeing, I think. Here's the intellectual search. We might arrange to take all possible arrangements of choices in order, go on until the machine proved a theorem which by its form could be verified to give a solution of the problem. Further research into intelligence of machinery will probably be very greatly concerned with searches of this kind. We may call such searches intellectual searches, so the search for algorithms. Now he has two other searches. One is the evolutionary search. It may be of interest to mention two other kinds of search in this connection. There is the genetical or evolutionary search by which a combination of genes is looked for, the criterion being survival value. The remarkable success of this search confirms to some extent the idea that intellectual activity consists mainly of various kinds of search. So he's sort of foreseeing computational biology, I think. He had read Watson and Crick. But it also expresses a kind of Peircean pragmatism about the evolution of signs and symbolic systems. So it begins to sound like Peirce. Okay, finally, there is what I love, the cultural search. The remaining form of search is what I should like to call the cultural search. Notice that culture is a matter that is not fixed. It is more like Wittgenstein's notion of a form of life, which you are searching for. It is not that you were handed down high culture from the past. The isolated man does not develop any intellectual power. It's necessary for him to be immersed in an environment of other men whose techniques he absorbs during the first 20 years of his life. He may then perhaps do a little research of his own and make a very few discoveries which are passed on. From this point of view, the search for new techniques, there's that word, must be regarded as carried out by the human community as a whole rather than by individuals. So he sees the kind of global nature of this world of AI. Okay, now I have a half an hour left, I guess, so we have to talk about the Turing Test, I think. 1950, the paper in mind. And Robin Gandy used to say that he would read out portions of this paper and start giggling. So there is a question how serious this paper was in Turing's mind. And interestingly, Norman Malcolm wrote to Wittgenstein after he read it and asked whether the article is a joke. So people were concerned that this was a joke at the time. And Wittgenstein wrote back and he says, well, I've met Turing. I don't think it's a leg pull, which is very funny. I don't think it's a joke. But he's not sure and he hasn't read it. So it's not clear Wittgenstein ever read it. So in the imitation game, of course, gender is used as the control. So the first game that you set up in order to argue sort of by method is that C has to guess, this is a bad picture, which is male and which is female. Of course, this is Turing playing with, gender roles of his time. But if we think about nowadays, we see that this makes it obvious that the social context in which the Turing imitation game is played is part of the setup. I mean, in that sense, it's like a language game, right? You're going to take certain things as fixed culturally in the backdrop. Okay, so then the Turing test for intelligent machine learning that you try to discuss. C will try to discuss to determine on the basis of exchanges through the screen, which is the machine and which is the computer. And of course, this has been being run annually. I think the last one, I can't remember. They used social media in the last one, and I think now they're not going to keep running it. Maybe people think ChatGPT has solved it. But I want to say that, again, it's a language game. So the social setting here is incredibly important because after this screen comes down, after A plays B, okay, the screen comes down, then A walks over to B and asks B, would you like a cup of coffee with me? And if, in this, I guess, C, if C has called B a machine too many times, B might not want to have a cup of coffee. And B might not like the test, right? So basically what we have here is, I think, an experiment in phraseology. We're interested in human-human interaction in the presence of machines, rather than simply in the question of whether you can build a machine that can fool a human. So I would say of this, what Wittgenstein said about Gödel, what are we to say now? That is our theme. So I think that the social side of this is important. Obviously, you can see it with mobile technology all over the place. We talk about the machines and about people all the time. So what I would say Turing is not doing with the Turing test is, first of all, he does not try to prove that machines can think. Secondly, he does not assume that behaviorism is true. Third, he's not trying to prove that machines are conscious and capable of emotion. He provides no definition of consciousness. He's not trying to explain or deny the fact of consciousness. He's not certainly trying to prove that humans are machines. He is not trying to prove that machines are indistinguishable from humans, although he envisions that this may happen a long time from now. He is certainly not stipulating an operational or behavioristic definition of intelligence, which is what you sometimes see people saying. And he's certainly not assuming that disinterpreted operations of signs are capable of grounding meaning. Yes.
Sorry, what does the latter mean?
The last one?
Yes.
There are a lot of objections to the Turing test by philosophers whom you may not have read. Okay.
Yes.
Who think that meaning, this is kind of a phenomenologist's objection. Somehow Turing has assumed that there are disinterpreted operations. It's kind of like the reading of Hilbert that I don't like. And that somehow you can reject this as a criterion of thinking by pointing out that there has to be meaning involved to begin with. Okay, but I think that the answer is that Turing is not assuming any kind of disinterpreted operations of signs. That is to say, the Turing imitation game is played in a world in which we live. Okay, so it's not that he's somehow boiling things down to some primitive level where you can then see that consciousness arises. What he is doing is he's showing that one cannot prove a negative result. For example, that machines cannot think, because as yet you don't have a clear enough notion of thinking. So that's a basic logical point we've already seen in connection with the impossibility result, the undecidability result of the 36 paper. Okay, every argument he gives is about that. He is showing us how we might explore together the emotional effects of computational machinery on our ways of expressing ourselves and our ways of discussing intelligence. He is framing a repeatable, social, philosophically minded, human-to-human experiment in phraseology or ordinary language in life. And I would say he's allowing us to make surveyable our concept of thinking. And I would say that that is an ongoing task today, but I'm going to stop at this point and not go further. And I have in the slides I can share, I have the papers that lie behind it.
Juliet, I hope that you remarked that this talk was communicated from the beginning to the end, so it's clearly very surveyable.
It's a surveyable. Yes, I had to go rather quickly, but I wanted to leave at least half an hour.
Okay.
So we could just-
Possibly we can begin by asking whether there is someone from the Zoom that has questions. Jose? No. Okay. Okay, so we can read the message. If no one has questions, can write the message and we can begin from here. So, please.
Yes.
I'm curious about the criteria for surveyability in Wittgenstein. In particular, there was one about the reproduction of a proof produces the same proof. I was curious how Wittgenstein cashes that out, or if he does, because kind of famously, the notion of even like meaning in mathematics for him seemed to depend on proof. Like he says something like, one would like to say that the understanding of the mathematical proposition is not guaranteed in its verbal form. And so I'm just kind of curious, like how are you individuating proofs and making them identical or?
Right. So this was a quote from Felix Mulholzer's book, which focuses on these 39, part 3 of Remarks on the Foundations, where surveyability is the central focus. And he's giving it a sort of Hilbertian twist. So the idea is there should be some way, not only of repeating the proof, but of recognizing when you have repeated it. Now, for Felix, this has almost a formal or symbolic structure because he's thinking of Hilbert and the strokes.
Okay.
And he's trying to bring Hilbert and the strokes very close to Wittgenstein, which is a huge contribution because 99% of all Wittgenstein scholars thought Hilbert was the enemy. So that's like a huge thing. But I think it's a little bit too formal. I think Wittgenstein is more pragmatic. So I would think that the better side of Wittgenstein would emphasize this notion of a technique. Okay, so there could be two proofs of if you like the same thing. As a side point, a lot of readers of Wittgenstein, Wittgenstein, he's writing in his manuscript notebooks. And, sometimes when you're working hard, you'll say things like, shit, I hate that guy. You say things that you don't want published.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
So, but they were published, so, okay. So you have to kind of get a feel for the manuscripts and look behind. That's what Felix Mulholzer is really wonderful at. You have to sort of see what it was like that day and what's going on. Sometimes Wittgenstein will raise a question about, can you have two different proofs of the same thing? Maybe that doesn't make sense, because if they're two different proofs, then you're proving something different.
Right.
He gets confused about result and method of solution. I don't read Wittgenstein as sharply saying if it's a different method of proof, then it's not the same result. Okay, but the question you're asking kind of gets us into that territory. And I think one reason he likes the idea of technique is there could be different techniques for resolving the same question. For example, Church, 1936 versus Turing, 1936. I would say that they resolve the Entscheidungsproblem, and I would say that's one problem. I would actually point out that Wittgenstein himself was the first to conjecture that problem in a letter to Russell of 1913, which is why he was interested in the result. But there are very radically different techniques for solving it. So different gearboxes. And the thing about a technique is if it solves a problem in one context, it might be used to solve a different problem in another context, or it might be lifted out of a proof, a modular part like Gödelization, and used in the context of a radically different proof. But I think that this notion of surveyability does depend upon our having some idea of the reproducibility and communicability of proof, Otherwise, the intersubjective communicability constraint is not held up. And again, there would be some perhaps psychological and educational preconditions for, understanding these various things. But the point is that the mark is a kind of mark of the form or concept of proof. It's part of what we mean by logic. Another thing that's part of what we mean by logic, I think, for someone like Wittgenstein, is that you can write the damn thing down. I think that was always part. Which doesn't mean that logic is based on language, in some cheap sense of analytic philosophy, because language is and extremely Wittgenstein has no analysis of what language is. But certainly that thought must be parametrized in some way that involves these issues of surveyability. That I'm taking some comment to the context. I'm not sure it is now. With ChatGPT, I don't know.
Just following up with, you can write the damn thing down.
Yeah.
What did you have in mind with you can't write it down? What would be an example of not being able to write it down? Like,
Trust me, I can get this out of, trust me, I can get this out in 100 lines if it could be approved.
right, okay, yeah, like.
Now,
that's
of
what-
course, if I'm a really great logician, you could trust me. But suppose you come back, and I say, gee, I can't do it today. Say, okay, I'll be back later. Can I give it to a student? And you say, no, I can't give it to a student. Now it's not sounding like proof. And mathematicians are very good, actually, I think, at detecting. And there are difficult cases, of course, of very gifted mathematicians announcing that they have results. You people know the examples better than I do. And then people begin to doubt. So then it could be a little hard to determine.
So there is Giselle, then Anna from the web, and Jose.
I am Anna.
Yes, thank you, Juliet. I was very happy.
Thank you. I like the smile. This makes me smile too. I don't know that many people.
So perhaps connecting back to Felix's analysis of surveyability with his 5 points, as you pointed out, I was curious about how do you, what do you do with the reproducibility as a picture? Because I know it, like your frame here is to show the anti-psychologist tone of everything, which I agree with. And you said, well, you lean towards thinking about surveyability as more like seeing what you mean by the procedure. And so there's like less weight on the visual aspect of it. But at the same time, the visual aspect is still important. So, and I think this is clear with this point in Felix's analysis with the reproducibility as a picture, right? Yes. So if you could say a little bit more about how do you integrate, which for me is it's inevitable, there is a visual aspect to it,
right? And
then how to, and then perhaps this connects with my second point, which would be something more like scholarly with the Wittgenstein thing, which is, do you see that already in the Tractatus in the analysis of number, or with his exposition, his construction of the concept of number, cardinal number, we already have something like this discussion about the role of the step and formal system in Turing. And this is an idea that a student of mine had a few years ago, which is to see in Wittgenstein's analysis of number, or in the Tractatus, an anticipation of what Turing is doing in the paper, with the analysis of the step, because the very idea of a formal series, right, that you have there. So, I mean, if it is too much, perhaps we can talk about later, but I would like to see, like, coming back to the Tractatus, what is already there, because I somehow think that it disconnects with the visual aspect of it, but.
Okay,
yeah, so.
Let me start with the second, which is a little easier first. So, yes, Wittgenstein takes as basic to logic in the Tractatus the notion of following a rule step by step. There's no doubt about that. He has the notion of a form series, and it still is somewhat open-ended as a question how much of logic you can fit into his use of form series, which are essentially recursive stretches of computation Okay, there's a question of how much logic that captures. So Kai Baemeyer has established you can get first order logic. Max Weiss thinks you can get Warren Goldfarb maybe somewhere in the middle between first and second order logic. You can go somehow beyond first order logic. There is no doubt that Wittgenstein was interested in Skolem for a reason. So he loved Skolem's work, on the recursive method of proof, and he spent an awful lot of time on it. So yes, partly what's behind this, though I didn't have time to do the Tractatus in middle of Wittgenstein, is it's part of Wittgenstein's life from the very beginning to be part of this interest in the recursive aspects. And he certainly seems to have thought that it belongs to the notion of the logical that I can follow a rule. So, Russell in Principia, and also in the earlier work on philosophy of math, Russell quotes from Lewis Carroll, The Paradox of Achilles and the Tortoise. Does everyone know this? You have, modus ponens, but you're not allowed to draw that unless you make explicit that you have a further rule and so on. Then you get a regress of rules. So Russell says in Principles of Math, this shows that logic is not fully formalizable. Wittgenstein's response is, no, logic is fully formalizable, but you have to take as basic the notion of following a rule. So that's already in early Wittgenstein. So that's another reason for him to be very interested in what he was doing. And there's a sort of necessity of the case. The analysis of number is problematic in a variety of different ways. I don't know. I won't say how satisfied or not I am with that, but I think that the interesting thing about taking the notion of a recursive steps, that's a very interesting sense of generality. And it governs Wittgenstein for most of his life. And there is some discussion of mathematical induction as a principle. He did establish some kind of rule of uniqueness you need if you don't have mathematical induction. Matthew Marion has seen that. So there's some sort of technical work there. Now, how does this connect with the idea of picture and visualization? So, right, pictures carry a certain amount of information in a given context where people know how to apply them. Okay. And of course, there are lots of arguments in philosophy of mathematics about whether, geometrical constructions in Euclid, you're going beyond logic or you're somehow appealing to visual elements. This is part of the bread and butter of Wittgenstein's education, because Frege and Russell do want to say, it's not the visual diagram that's carrying the reasoning. It has to be something that is logical. Okay. And you can see the same thing, by the way, in Littlewood, in the way the students are taught at Cambridge. But by picture, Wittgenstein means in the later philosophy something far more attenuated, I think. A picture is it's a mode of self-criticism, because he's sort of criticizing his earlier use of picture in the Tractatus. But the notion of picture in the Tractatus is not a representational picture. It is some kind of algebraical notion, right? That somehow you can project sameness in some dimension or other between the Playmobil people here, and Walter Carneal here. So there is some kind of notion of transformation that is some quasi-mathematical or quasi.
And then internal relations are key.
Yeah, and internal relations are key. But also in the investigations, and here I'm influenced very much by Stanley Cavell's reading of the opening, the idea that what Augustine gives us is a picture of the essence of human language, it's a very specific form of criticism. It doesn't mean, Augustine forgot about verbs and, negation, and he's just empirically, that's not what the criticism is. The criticism is that somehow a picture gives you a whole way of looking at something, which shapes your conception of what the logical and grammatical relations are. So I would go toward that as the deep notion of picture involved in later Wittgenstein. And, this can be very important. He thinks philosophy is about unearthing, if you like, the first steps. When the picture is set up, it's much more important to think about the first steps than about all the inferences you draw from those first steps. The thing is to look at when the picture gets set up. Now, he's thinking, therefore, that a proof is a certain kind of conceptual construction that gives you a certain way of looking at things. So I think the aspect perception, I'm looking at someone working on it, the aspect perception is very important. So it's part of the ways in which mathematics consists of conceptual constructions. It consists of helping you find ways of looking at things. And I think Turing's analysis of computability is an absolutely perfect example of that. It's a snapshot. It gives you a way of looking at it. And that's how progress is made. So I didn't connect those two things with one another very well. But they're both important.
Just as a quick follow-up, you mentioned algebraic notion of picture. Is that your concept, or I really like it, so I want to read more about an algebra?
Well, I'm now working at the moment on Suzanne Langer. How many people have heard of Suzanne Langer?
What?
Suzanne Langer. You see, this is, okay, some people get erased from the history of philosophy, really unfairly. So I'm writing a Stanford Encyclopedia article on her. She was a student of Scheffer's at Harvard, and she went to Vienna and worked with the Gestalt psychologists. And she wrote probably the best-selling book in English in the 20th century philosophy called Philosophy in a New Key. She was interested in music, forms of life. She was extremely influenced by Wittgenstein. And her dissertation of 1926, which I commend to you, it's up on the web, gives an incredible reading of the Tractatus. It's quite wonderful. Because she comes out of the American school of logic, Scheffer, of course, studied not only with Russell, but with Royce, and probably met Peirce. Her reading of the picture idea in the Tractatus is the idea of some kind of algebraical sameness. So she's very good. She, very early on, this is 1926, she sees that the Tractatus is not some work of empiricism where you have a photocopy view mentally somehow. The picture theory is not some form of isomorphic projection, but meaning in general is transformative. You are showing how one set of forms can be transposed or projected into another set of forms. And her whole view on aesthetics is refracted through this whole thing. Then she gets interested in Cassirer, she's interested in Cassirer. So there are many things she does with that idea, but that's her view of meaning.
Interesting. I'm working on Oswald Veblen's
Okay.
work, and he's credited with coming up with categorical systems in his dissertation, and it sounds
What year is his dissertation?
1904.
Okay, and for all I know, and we've just managed to get OCR'd her 10,000 3x5 cards where she kept track of everything she read. She did read Turing's paper on morphogenesis. I was amazed. She may have known about it.
Yeah. I mean, he's at Princeton. It's not far.
Right. And certainly Scheffer would have too.
Yeah.
So she's also a really good guide to, I have published a paper on Scheffer and C.I. Lewis. She is a really interesting guide to what Scheffer thought. And remember, Scheffer went to study with Russell the year before Wittgenstein. He had a Sheldon, so he went in 1910. And the only reason we know how Wittgenstein was taught logic by Russell is from Scheffer's notes. They're the only extant notes of Russell's lectures at Principia in 1910. And then Scheffer went to see Piano, Brawley Forte, he went to Italy, he spoke a lot of language, Frege. So he then imports this back into the American context, and Langer is one of his first PhD students. So someday I'm going to write with Sanford Shea a book that sounds contradictory. It will have the title Logic in America. But we've decided, maybe we won't be able to get that sold. But anyway, there is this wonderful tradition.
Anna, you want to ask your question?
Well, it's more or less the same question that was asked about pictures, but I can put it in the form of a follow-up. So I was wondering about your reluctance to talk about Übersichtlichkeit in terms of vision and in terms of pictures in the end, because it strikes me, there's one way of translating that is like synoptic representation or synoptic presentation that I think somewhere Wittgenstein also, I have to find that, but I think there is a passage somewhere in which Wittgenstein translate that exactly that way. And I think it had this aspect of being able to convey or to see synoptically something is important. And I get it at what you're objecting to maybe is not the idea of a picture that is somehow embodied in that, but the idea of the perceptual aspect. I don't know if that is the case, but yeah, it's just a follow-up because more or less you talked about this already.
Yeah, a synopsis, thank you, Anna, it's helpful. There is a passage, but I forget what it is right now. So a synopsis is a kind of grammatical snapshot that gets you far enough that you can move on with something. And let's say a language game might be an example of something like that, a snapshot of a limited portion of human linguistic behavior designed for a particular purpose, something like that. The important point would be that there are a variety of different cases, of course, not that you were denying this. And also, Wittgenstein is not giving an analysis of the notion of language in the later philosophy, or an analysis of the notion of meaning. That strikes me as very, very important. You never get such an analysis in the investigations. Is that okay with you, Anna?
Yes, totally.
Yeah. Okay. But you could translate the German as model or structure. So a proof must be a structure of a certain kind would be okay. And of course, aspect perception, like Langer, of course, Langer, because of Wittgenstein, they take this very seriously, the idea that there's a whole that's put together that in some sense conveys better than an analysis of the parts treated somehow extensionally. But I would say that what a picture has to do with is establishing some kind of context in which procedures can go on that are recognizably procedures either elaborating or repeating what has come before. So I don't think you were denying that either, right?
Right, yes, thank you.
Right. But there are readers of Wittgenstein who think that aspect perception has to be non-theoretical at all costs. It's kind of more of a phenomenological reading of what aspect perception is. And well, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that we're not always perceiving aspects. I mean, Wittgenstein is I don't always see a pen as a pen. I mean, sometimes I just see the pen. There are readers who think this, and they think that somehow it's like phenomenology, where you're going to break the hold of the logic by going to the phenomenology. This is always the idea. In Wittgenstein, I think it's very different. You have an interplay between the logic and the phenomenology all the time. So that's what makes him different. And he never uses the phenomenology. He uses Lebensform, but he never uses the phenomenologist notion of a life world. That certainly is not by accident. It doesn't occur. And he certainly read Heidegger. He certainly knows what he's doing. So the problem is that the phenomenologist notion of the life world presupposes a kind of meaningful whole, you know, Dasein and Heidegger with the hammer, and we have some kind of meaningful action. But by the time we get to the investigation, and it's 1945, and we've opened up the camps and dropped nuclear weapons on civilians, once we get there, it's not at all clear, as I read the investigations, that there will be some kind of coherent culture. The word culture was excised from the manuscript in 1937. It does not occur. That's very important. He's writing it for a world without culture, and he's writing it for a world in which it is not clear, nor does he think it will be clear for us, which is why I think it's such a relevant book, whether this stuff is going to add up into a meaningful life world. You can't take that for granted at the start. If you get it, you get it. But you're not going to enter in as your starting point in thinking about logic that you have some kind of meaningful life world, because as far as he's concerned in 1945, we don't. And I would say this is why I think the book was written with Turing in mind. I mean, when he says there's no formal unity to logic, he knows of what he's speaking. He knows that because of Turing, it's not so. So the basic notion is that of a partial function, not a general function. And that has a lot of implications for how you look at the reality of the logic of history, if you like. So I'm sorry, Anna, you got me like a runaway train with that. It's not phenomenology. I have a question at the back, Marco.
Ben, go.
You said it excised in 1937, which of course occurred before 1945. So, but it was the emphasis was.
I'm sorry.
not on-
Yeah, it was excised and form of life comes in 37. Okay. Once he has read Turing's paper and he's realizing culture, he can't use, to imagine a language is not to imagine a culture, it's to imagine a form of life. And for me, forms of life are rather different from culture. And then I'm saying that from that point on, the notion of culture, which was fundamental in the Blue Book, to imagine a language is to imagine a culture. It was very anthropological, right? It was tribes and stuff like that. He realizes that that form of anthropology is bad. It makes it sound like there's some kind of natural anthropological way of looking at these tribes that somehow can compound language games. The word culture never appears again in the manuscript after 1937. So I'm sorry, I wasn't clear about that. But that's got to be intentional.
Concluding, or may I have one more question?
Cool.
One of the great, you said one of Turing's great achievements was to use the machines, his machines, to give a reductive analysis. And I may have just missed it, but I'm wondering, it's a reductive analysis, what exactly? At first I thought you may have said something like he was giving a reductive analysis of formal systems as such. But I wonder if that's the case. I mean, the purpose was to see which systems have a single complete decision procedure, the decidability problem.
No, it's a larger, it's to decide whether there is one system or one algorithm that could decide for any arbitrary one, whether or not, okay, one sentence follows from another or whether the computation will stop. Okay? So what I'm saying is that in order to establish that there is no such machine, he was forced to give a general analysis of what any such machine would look like, and that he manages to do that precisely by not being psychologistically reductive or symbolically reductive, but by coming up with this language game-like picture of a human being with signs who can take the symbols in at a glance and hand off to a fellow worker what's going on. He finds it in the everyday marks by means of which we have human computers, because of course computer meant a human. So I'm saying that that's what's unusual. That's not part of the lambda calculus analysis. That's not part of the HGK systems. This is a new move. And I'm saying, well, I have an account of how that happened, which is he read the Blue Book and he read the Brown Book. But it's not reductive in another sense. He's not saying it doesn't count as a proof, if no human being carries this out. But he's very carefully titrating his analysis of formal system to the Hilbertian context. And the notion of surveyability is very important. And it's beautiful that his analysis, as Claney says, is regarded as the surveyable one. It's the one that seems relatively unproblematic.
So maybe reductive wouldn't be the best word, for surveyable.
Yeah, a language game, okay, the way I read Wittgenstein, he's just wrong. Sometimes he says our language is a language game. He's just wrong. He should have thrown that out. But a language game is a snapshot, here I will use the notion of picture, of a limited portion of human linguistic behavior designed to shed light in a particular direction. That's what a language game is. But it doesn't give us an analysis of language.
Thank you.
Just a brief comment. I was very surprised about Gödel speaking about Turing in this form, because I thought that Gödel considered his own proof to be independent of the formalism because of the title that he gives to the paper. The paper is on formally undecidable propositions of Principia Mathematica and related systems.
Right.
And of course, even though the proof is about Principia Mathematica, I thought that he was considering, because he was in related system, his paper to be a technique that shows you how to produce a proof,
right,
given any other system.
Right.
So in that sense, it was independent of the formalism. Yeah,
right.
But it's very surprising that years later he was saying Turing.
Yes, and Gödel went on to try to reproduce what Turing did for the notions of provability and definability. This is what's really weird. He thought he could get absolute measures of definability and provability. And there's some work being done by people to think about what that could possibly mean. Because normally you would think definability certainly depends upon particular language. But he's so interested in transcending the limitations of any formalism that this is what he tries to do in set theory. So it is rather surprising. But it makes perfect sense if you've read the paper. And similar systems. Well, okay, so somebody could come up.
I have a question, but I'm a little bit afraid to ask this question.
I have nowhere in particular to
Okay.
go without.
So it's that we are told it appear quite clearly what are the influence on Wittgenstein and Turing. What it appears much less clearly what are the influence, if there are, of Turing.
The other direction is much harder. Okay, so it's really kind of speculative. So what do I have? I have, okay, so I've published some papers. I have all the evidence that I can get so far. So 1937, we see a shift. Turing sends him the paper. We know that. Starts getting absolutely obsessed with rule following, making logic homespun. Okay, these are circumstantial pieces of evidence, but it seems right. And then he writes the first version of Philosophical Investigations, which has the second half of it, which was later published as Remarks on the Foundations of Math, Part 1. So the original version of the Investigations, which he did turn into the Cambridge Press, but he didn't let it be published. He only did that so he could get a professorship because of the Anschluss, and he was worried about bias. So he turns that in. But I would say more generally, when he says in the opening of the preface to the Investigations, I realized that logic, he says, I wish that I could have written a book. I was trying to write a book that was gap-free. Okay, now the allusion to Frege is obvious. It's the Begriffsschrift. In his preface, he's alluding back to the Begriffsschrift. I'm so angry at the translation that Peter Hacker, I'm sure not Schulte, is responsible for. They translate this instead of gap-free, lückenlos is what it is in German. They translate it as coarse or something like that. That's just to erase the influence of Frege. Just Hacker doesn't like it. But anyway, Wittgenstein says, I wanted to write something which would be gap-free. And then I realized logic doesn't have the formal unity that I thought. Okay, now that is definitely reinforced, if nothing else, by the Turing paper. The basic point about the Turing stuff is that the notion of a partial function is basic. It's the more general. So basically, you have nonsense. You can't get rid of nonsense at the foundation of logic. What could be more central to philosophical investigations? It seems to be. And as far as I'm concerned, nonsense is a growth field. It has been for about 20 years. So this is how I would argue that the impact of Turing was serious. And then you can look at the manuscripts in 39 when Turing is in the class and look at the remarks on Cantor's diagonal argument, and you can make sense of the Cantor diagonal argument stuff if you remember Turing's diagonal argument. Then there's a reason why Wittgenstein says there are puffed up versions of Cantor's proof. It's not that he thinks there's something wrong with Cantor, but he's pointing out diagonalization is a technique, and you don't have to accept the extensional point of view in order to accept the use of the technique. And he knows that from Turing's paper. And again, you look in Turing's paper, and Turing has a footnote to Hobson, who is the Functions of a Real Variable textbook used at Cambridge. He footnotes the place where Hobson presents the Cantor argument. And what does he do? He doesn't think, Hobson, that it shows that there are uncountable infinities. He doesn't look at it extensionally. He says, well, it turns out our concept of a real number doesn't have a certain formal unity. So there's plenty of reason to think that Wittgenstein's ways of, breaking off lines of argument, shifting things, you can always keep doing it. This kind of echoes in a way what Turing is saying about computation. Anyway, that's not very well argued, but I said it better in certain other papers. I'm sure I could say it better still. So that's a harder direction. On the other hand, no one else has an account of why Wittgenstein gets to his later method of writing in 1937. 36, 37. So I'm the only one with an account. So it's a just so story. Let someone else do better. So far, I don't see it. I mean, you could say, well, he develops this style and it's very poetic and we like that and stuff.
It was already poetic in the Tractatus.
He was very poetic in the Tractatus. So you have to say something specific about why the investigations looks the way it does. And I have a rigorous account of why it does.
He wanted it to look a certain way, and then he read Turing and it fell apart. Is that right?
No, he had confidence, you see, that the idea of logic as a piecemeal activity, right? That argumentation inherently exists with margins around the edge, that you could put it together with other forms of argumentation, but that somehow it would be unforeseeable in general how you would do that. That makes perfect sense. Also, the notion of following a rule is fundamental to the nature of logic. And then he's very interested in that. So that's my argument.
So does that mean that Wittgenstein took from Turing that using logic as a foundation cannot work?
I think Wittgenstein always thought, he thought that in the Tractatus. Right? He says the set theory is superfluous.
Mhm.
He never was an extensionalist, okay? We just have to say he was very old-fashioned in this respect. But he got more sophisticated.
Mhm.
So one reason that the set theory is not foundational is the unsurveyability of, proofs in Principia Mathematica.
Mhm.
So you have to look at how mathematical practice adheres and all of that. Yes, I would say that by 1939, this does begin to explain some things. And I have the 39 lectures with Turing in the room in order to give me some material to argue with as well, because we have records of them talking.
Provisions?
Provisions.